In this video, I'm going to talk about a couple of mistakes you'd want to avoid while building your story bank, and ultimately how to give better answers to interview questions. The first one I'd like to talk about here is naming your stories. And the main challenge here with naming your stories is that so many of you give vague names, ambiguous names to your stories. To give an example here, spotting potholes in Seattle versus accurately predicting something using AI. Okay, so the first one, potholes in Seattle. The second, prediction and AI. Which one is easier to find out if you have 25 or 50 stories? Of course, the first one. So that's why I encourage you, when naming your stories, to understand exactly the context. Why are you naming these stories? So you can easily reference them later on. So that's why keywords, names would be the best to name your stories. Okay, this was the first one. Second one, the difference between stories and answers. So to give an example here, some of you have this habit of adding a story as a question with an answer below. You could call that a story as well, but the problem is this. When you answer a question, a time when you had to deal with an ambiguous situation, you just focus on answering that specific question. Whereas if you focus on giving the story of a time when you had to deal with an ambiguous situation, you could also give a lot more detail than just strictly answering that interview question. So for example, you could make that a brain dump of several pages, and which you can later revise. Okay, and often I exemplify this as an exercise. If you try to answer, give me a time when you had to deal with an ambiguous situation, if you answer the question on the spot and you compare that answer with something on the lines of where you have a story bank, a brain dump of 2 pages, and then give again the same answer to that interview question, you'll notice that the second time you give the answer will be 10 times better than the first one. Right? So this is the purpose of a story bank, to gather all the details on key behaviors which you could use then when needed to your advantage in a job interview. Right, next one, spreadsheets versus a narrative format. So it's quite common online to find advice on how to store your story bank. You can, by the way, store it for free on my website. But there is a different approach that some recommend to keep your story bank as a spreadsheet. And the problem with spreadsheets is that I use this all the time, but for quantitative stuff, to keep track of my expense, to predict my sales and stuff like this. Whereas a story bank is something, a more narrative and something which you're supposed to benefit from because it's a narrative format. Right? Remember when I said making a brain dump of several pages for each of your stories, if you can, to remember all the details, because this is what's valuable during these job interviews, to differentiate yourself from other candidates. So the problem with a spreadsheet is that it's too structured. It's not focused on necessarily on detail and on narrative. Right? However, if you're an expert with these things, if communication is your strength and you have no problem remembering all the details for your projects, which from experience it's rarely the case, then spreadsheets could work as well. But in my experience, keeping them in a narrative format is significantly better. Okay, next one, the star format. So the challenge is this: some of you have this habit of keeping your stories in the star format. Okay, it's not something that I consider necessarily a mistake, so long you keep in mind that the purpose of a story is to contain all the possible relevant information to highlight that specific behavior that you're adding your stories from. Okay, whereas a star format, the main purpose of a star answer is to have a sort of an API with your interviewer, so you understand each other best. Okay, so structuring your story in the star format is super important for the purpose of giving an answer in the star format during your job interview. Whereas keeping your story is not the main highlight to keep them in the star format, because again, a story is detail oriented on the key behavior that you're interested to highlight, right? It can be in any format you like. And by the way, if you write a story for 2 pages, good luck keeping that into a star format. It's not the main thing, simply. Okay, so long story short, it's not mandatory to keep your story in the star format. Whereas it is a good advice to answer interview questions during your interview in the star format. Okay, so this would be for the star. Next one here, vague examples. Okay, so there is this trend of using ChatGPT and other resources, even trainings and other examples, of people giving you examples of sample answers to interview questions. The problem with 99% of those answers is that they are too vague. Okay, and the challenge here is that when you see something and you try to reference that to do in your own stories, your stories will ultimately sound vague. Because if I ask ChatGPT to give me 10 examples of answers to questions, 9 of them at least will be vague, too vague for the purpose of a job interview. And you will have a tendency to clone that as well. My encouragement would be to again focus on keywords. As I said in the beginning of the video, naming your stories with keywords, potholes in Seattle, with something very easy, something memorable if you want, is a focus you must have when writing your stories. It is super important for your stories to sound peculiar, because the goal in the job interview is to differentiate yourself from other candidates, right? So ambiguous stories, vague stories, try to scan your story bank, because I'm sure your stories can always get more specific, and the more specific they get, it's ultimate to your advantage. Okay, a quick example here in the situation part. When did that story happen? What was your role? Okay, this would be 2 questions I'd start with respect to specificity. Okay, next one, rewarding your story using various resources. You could, for example, hire someone to work on your stories, and they could be great writers, and they could reward your story to sound 10 times better than what it sounded when you did it. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Okay, and in my experience, it's not a good idea to use someone else's language in your own answers. It's a very good idea if you can take bits of information and maybe expression, maybe other techniques to present things. For example, the star format to transform into a Dix format, into a more dramatic format if you want, but it's a bad idea to clone someone else's answers, someone else's language for the purpose of a job interview. And it's the same with ChatGPT. ChatGPT is an excellent tool that gives you great marketing pitches. Like everyone is using it even for commercial purposes. So I have no doubt that ChatGPT will reward your answers to sound 10 times better than yours. But this doesn't mean you should use their language. You should only take bits of information that you could confidently take advantage of during a job interview. Whereas if you take entire answers, I doubt you'll be able to give those answers word by word for the purpose of the interview, right? Even myself in my trainings, I was amazed how well ChatGPT rewarded my answers as marketing pitches. Yet still, I prefer to keep my language, maybe do another revision by myself, but I believe it's more valuable, it's more genuine and a bit more peculiar to have answers with your language. Okay, so long story short, be careful rewarding your stories into someone else's language, because this is also a well-known trap you'd want to avoid here. And just finally, you can have the best story bank, the most stories if you want. You can have 100 stories in your story bank. That story bank is going to worth not much unless you revise those stories at least 3 times. Okay, so at least 3 revisions to your stories are required. So you considerably improve the quality of your stories and ultimately answers during a job interview. And last but not least, one thing you could check in your story bank if it contains at least a failure story, at least a proper failure story with proper learnings. I know it's uncomfortable, but many people fail to do this, and I believe it's an excellent example to significantly ramp up your interviewing skills, right? So I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.